In the summer of 1970, a freight train carrying federal currency rolled into a Vancouver rail yard for what should have been a routine stop. Within 12 minutes, the train departed on schedule. What no one realized until hours later was that $2.5 million in cash had vanished without a trace. No alarms sounded, no witnesses came forward, and no suspects emerged from the investigation that followed. The heist was so clean, so precisely executed, that it seemed to defy explanation. For over 5 decades, the case remained one of Canada's most perplexing unsolved crimes. Then, in the spring of 2024, during the demolition of an abandoned storage facility on the outskirts of Vancouver, construction workers made a discovery that would crack open a mystery buried for 54 years. Hidden behind a false wall in a forgotten maintenance room, they found a rusted metal locker. Inside that locker was a single piece of evidence that investigators had never seen before. A handwritten note bearing a name that had never appeared in any police report, any witness statement, or any investigative file connected to the robbery. That name was about to unravel the most sophisticated freight yard heist in Canadian history. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Vancouver freight yard robbery of 1970 wasn't just about the money that disappeared. It was about the impossible precision with which it vanished. This wasn't a smash-and-grab operation carried out by desperate criminals. This was methodical, patient, and executed by individuals who understood every detail of how federal currency moved through the Canadian rail system. The planning alone would have taken months. The execution required insider knowledge that went far beyond what any casual observer could obtain. What made this case so baffling wasn't just the absence of evidence. It was the complete lack of disruption to the normal flow of operations. The train arrived on time, departed on time, and followed its scheduled route. The crew noticed nothing unusual. The security protocols appeared intact. Even the manifest documentation remained perfectly organized. It was as if the money had simply evaporated from existence, leaving behind only paperwork that proved it had once been there. For investigators in 1970, the case presented challenges that stretched the limits of forensic capability. Fingerprint analysis was rudimentary, surveillance systems were scarce, and communication between different law enforcement agencies often relied on telephone calls and physical paperwork. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police took jurisdiction over the federal theft, but their investigation yielded frustratingly few leads. Interviews with rail yard employees, security personnel, and transportation contractors produced no useful information. The money trail went cold almost immediately. The stolen currency had been packed in sealed canvas bags, each marked with federal Treasury identification numbers and loaded under armed escort in Toronto. The train's manifest showed the exact contents, weights, and destination details for every piece of cargo. Yet, somewhere between the moment the train entered the Vancouver yard and the moment it continued toward its final destination, those specific bags containing the cash had been replaced with identical containers filled with worthless paper. The switch was so seamless that even the weight distribution remained consistent. This level of sophistication suggested the involvement of someone with intimate knowledge of federal transportation procedures. Someone who knew exactly which cars carried currency, how the bags were marked, where they were positioned, and how long the train would remain stationary. The investigation focused heavily on current and former employees of the railway system, federal transportation contractors, and security personnel with access to sensitive shipping information. But after 18 months of intensive inquiry, no arrests were made. The case file eventually grew to over 800 pages of witness statements, forensic reports, and investigative notes. Every lead had been pursued, every connection examined, every theory tested against the available evidence. The conclusion reached by investigators was both simple and unsatisfying. The robbery had been carried out by a highly organized group with insider access and professional discipline. But who they were, how they had executed the plan, and what had happened to the money remained completely unknown. By 1975, the active investigation was officially suspended. The stolen funds were declared unrecoverable by federal authorities, and the insurance claims were processed and paid. The case was filed away in the RCMP archives, where it would remain untouched for decades. Occasionally, a new detective would review the materials, hoping to find something previous investigators had missed. But the evidence always led to the same dead end. The freight yard where the robbery occurred continued operating for another 20 years before being gradually phased out as shipping patterns changed and newer facilities were constructed. By the mid-1990s, most of the original buildings had been sold to private companies or converted to other uses. The rail lines were eventually removed, and the property was rezoned for commercial development. What had once been a bustling hub of federal transportation became a collection of warehouses, storage facilities, and light industrial buildings. One of those facilities was a nondescript concrete structure that had served various purposes over the years. Originally built as a maintenance shed for railway equipment, it was later converted to general storage space and rented to different businesses as their needs changed. By 2020, the building had been vacant for several years. Its windows were boarded up, its roof showed signs of deterioration, and weeds grew through cracks in the surrounding pavement. The property had been purchased by a development company planning to demolish the existing structures and build a modern retail complex. The demolition was routine work, the kind of job that required more muscle than finesse. The building's interior had been stripped of anything valuable years earlier, leaving behind only concrete walls, exposed electrical conduits, and the occasional piece of forgotten equipment. The crew worked methodically, section by section, using sledgehammers and crowbars to break down partition walls and clear debris. It was during this process that they encountered something unexpected. In what had once been a small maintenance office at the rear of the building, one of the workers noticed that his sledgehammer produced a different sound when it struck a particular section of wall. Instead of the solid thud of concrete meeting concrete, there was a hollow echo that suggested empty space behind the surface. Curious, the worker examined the wall more closely and discovered hairline cracks that formed the outline of a hidden panel. When they pried away the false wall, they found a narrow space that had been concealed for decades. The cavity was just large enough to hold a single metal storage locker, the kind used in schools or gymnasiums. The locker was heavily rusted and required considerable effort to open. Its hinges had seized from years of moisture and neglect, and the metal had corroded to the point where parts of the door crumbled when touched. Inside the locker, wrapped in multiple layers of deteriorated plastic sheeting, was a manila envelope. The envelope itself had suffered from decades of humidity and temperature fluctuations. Its edges were brittle, its surface was stained and discolored, and the adhesive on the flap had long since failed. But the contents remained intact, protected by the plastic wrapping that had kept moisture from completely destroying the paper inside. The envelope contained a single handwritten note composed on plain white paper with blue ballpoint ink. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, as if the author had taken time to ensure legibility. At the top of the page was a date, July 15, 1970, just one day before the freight yard robbery. Below that was a name that would change everything investigators thought they knew about the case. The name was Marcus Chen. Marcus Chen was a name that had never appeared in any of the original investigation files. Not in witness statements, not in employee records, not in background checks of potential suspects. For the RCMP investigators who first examined the handwritten note in 2024, it was as if this person had materialized from thin air. but the date on the note, combined with its location in a hidden compartment near the original crime scene, made it impossible to dismiss as coincidental. The note itself was brief, containing only a few lines of text below Chen's name. It referenced a meeting scheduled for the following evening at a location described simply as the North Warehouse. There was mention of final preparations and a reminder about timing being critical. The handwriting was steady, suggesting someone comfortable with written communication, and the phrasing indicated familiarity with industrial terminology. Most significantly, the note concluded with specific reference to federal transport schedules and car positioning. Detective Sarah Morrison of the RCMP Cold Case Unit was assigned to investigate this new development. Morrison had built her career on examining evidence that others had overlooked, and she understood that even the smallest detail could reshape an entire case. The discovery of Marcus Chen's name represented the first genuine breakthrough in the freight yard robbery, since the original investigation had stalled in the early 1970s. Morrison's first task was to determine whether Marcus Chen had actually existed. In 1970, record-keeping was largely paper-based, and many documents from that era had been lost, destroyed, or poorly archived over the decades. Immigration records, employment files, and even basic identification documents from the period often existed only in physical form, stored in various government facilities across the country. The search would require methodical examination of multiple databases and archives. The investigation began with Canadian immigration records from the 1960s and early 1970s. During that period, Canada had experienced significant immigration from Hong Kong and other parts of Asia, driven by economic opportunities and political instability in the region. Many of these immigrants had settled in Vancouver, drawn by job opportunities in shipping, construction, and manufacturing. Morrison requested access to archived immigration files, focusing specifically on individuals with the surname Chen, who had arrived in British Columbia during the relevant time frame. The search yielded dozens of potential matches. Chen was a common surname, and the record showed numerous individuals who had immigrated to Vancouver in the years leading up to 1970. But most of these records contained only basic information: names, dates of arrival, and intended destinations. Few included detailed personal information or employment history that might connect them to the freight yard robbery. Morrison expanded her search to include employment records from the Canadian National Railway and Canadian Pacific Railway, the two major rail companies operating in Vancouver during 1970. These records proved more challenging to access, as many had been transferred between different corporate entities over the decades, as the companies merged, restructured, and modernized their operations. Some files had been digitized, but others remained in physical storage, requiring manual examination. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing archived payroll records from a railway maintenance contractor, Morrison discovered an entry for Marcus Chen dated March 1970. The record showed that Chen had been employed as a temporary maintenance worker for a 3-month period, with duties that included equipment repair and facility upkeep. His work assignment had included the Vancouver freight yard where the robbery occurred. This single payroll entry transformed the investigation. Chen wasn't just a random name found in a hidden note. He had been physically present at the crime scene in the months leading up to the robbery. He had legitimate access to areas of the freight yard that were normally restricted to authorized personnel, and his temporary employment status meant that he could have gathered information about security procedures and transportation schedules without attracting suspicion from regular staff. Morrison immediately requested additional records related to Chen's employment. The contractor's files, though incomplete, revealed that Chen had been hired through a temporary labor agency that specialized in placing workers in industrial and transportation jobs. His employment application, discovered in a box of archived paperwork, provided the first detailed information about his background. According to the application, Marcus Chen was 29 years old in 1970 and had immigrated to Canada from Hong Kong in 1967. He listed previous experience in mechanical repair and warehouse operations, skills that would have made him valuable for maintenance work in a freight facility. The application included a Vancouver address and a telephone number, though both were decades out of date. More significantly, the employment records showed that Chen's work assignment had ended abruptly on July 10, 1970, just 6 days before the robbery. His supervisor had noted that Chen had failed to report for work without explanation and could not be reached at his listed contact information. At the time, his disappearance had been treated as a routine case of worker abandonment, common in temporary employment situations. No effort had been made to track him down or investigate his departure. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Chen had worked at the freight yard for 3 months, gaining intimate knowledge of its operations and security procedures. He had access to information about train schedules, cargo manifests, and the specific protocols used for handling federal currency shipments. Then, less than a week before the robbery, he had vanished without a trace. Morrison's investigation took on new urgency. She reached out to immigration officials requesting comprehensive records for Marcus Chen's entry into Canada and any subsequent documentation of his activities. She contacted the Vancouver Police Department to search for any reports or incidents involving Chen during his time in the city. She even arranged for forensic analysis of the handwritten note, hoping to extract additional information from the paper and ink that might provide clues about when and where it had been written. The immigration records provided additional details about Chen's background. He had arrived in Vancouver aboard a passenger ship from Hong Kong on September 15, 1967. His immigration documents listed his occupation as mechanic and indicated that he had family connections in Vancouver's Chinatown district. The records showed that he had been processed through the standard immigration procedures of the time and granted permission to remain in Canada as a landed immigrant. But after his arrival, Marcus Chen had left very little documentary trail. There were no tax filings in his name, no property purchases, no marriage certificates or birth records for children. It was as if he had deliberately avoided creating the kind of paper trail that would normally accumulate over 3 years of residence in Canada. This pattern of minimal documentation was consistent with someone who either preferred to remain invisible to authorities or who was planning to leave the country. The forensic analysis of the handwritten note provided some additional insights. The paper was consistent with standard office supplies available in 1970, and the ink matched the chemical composition of ballpoint pens commonly used during that period. More importantly, handwriting experts determined that the note had been written by someone whose primary language was not English. Certain letter formations and spacing patterns suggested a writer more familiar with Chinese characters adapting to English script. These findings supported the theory that Marcus Chen had been the author of the note. But they also raised new questions about his role in the robbery and his connection to other members of what appeared to be a larger conspiracy. The note's reference to a meeting and final preparations suggested that Chen was part of a coordinated group, not a lone actor. The hidden location where the note was discovered indicated that someone had gone to considerable effort to preserve evidence of the planning process. Morrison began to develop a profile of Marcus Chen based on the available evidence. He was likely an experienced mechanic or maintenance worker who had immigrated to Canada with the intention of participating in a major criminal enterprise. His temporary employment at the freight yard had been deliberately chosen to provide access and intelligence gathering opportunities. His disappearance immediately before the robbery suggested that he had either fled the country or gone into deep hiding to avoid detection. But one crucial question remained unanswered. If Marcus Chen had been part of the robbery conspiracy, Why had he left behind evidence that could potentially expose the entire operation? The hidden note seemed to serve no practical purpose unless it was intended as some form of insurance or leverage against his co-conspirators. The careful concealment suggested that Chen had anticipated the possibility of future investigation and wanted to ensure that his role would eventually be discovered. As Morrison continued her investigation, she began to suspect that the story of the Vancouver freight yard robbery was far more complex than anyone had previously imagined. The breakthrough in Marcus Chen's identity opened new investigative pathways that had been impossible to pursue in 1970. Detective Morrison assembled a team of specialists, including immigration historians, forensic accountants, and experts in organized crime patterns from that era. What they discovered painted a picture of a conspiracy far more sophisticated than the original investigators had imagined. Chen's immigration documents revealed connections that had been overlooked for decades. His sponsor in Canada was listed as Thomas Wong, a Vancouver businessman who operated a small import-export company in Chinatown. Wong had vouched for Chen's character and employment prospects, providing the necessary assurances required by immigration authorities. But when Morrison attempted to trace Wong's business records, she found that the company had been dissolved in late 1970, just months after the robbery. The timing raised immediate suspicions. Morrison requested archived business registration documents and discovered that Wong's import company had been registered in 1968, operated for exactly 2 years, and then voluntarily dissolved with no explanation provided to authorities. The business had maintained a small office on Pender Street and claimed to specialize in mechanical equipment and industrial supplies. Its client list, preserved in dusty filing cabinets at the provincial archives, included several transportation and logistics companies. Among those clients was the same temporary labor agency that had placed Marcus Chen at the freight yard. The connection was subtle but unmistakable. Wong's company had apparently served as an intermediary, providing both immigration sponsorship for Chen and business relationships that facilitated his eventual placement in a position with access to federal transportation security. Morrison expanded her investigation to include Thomas Wong's background. Immigration records showed that Wong had arrived in Vancouver in 1965, 2 years before Chen. Unlike Chen, Wong had left a more substantial paper trail. He had purchased property, filed tax returns, and maintained bank accounts under his legal name. But his financial records revealed patterns that didn't align with the modest import business he claimed to operate. Bank deposits during 1968 and 1969 showed irregular but substantial cash transactions that far exceeded what a small import company would typically generate. The deposits were carefully structured to avoid reporting thresholds, suggesting someone with sophisticated knowledge of financial regulations. More intriguingly, the deposits stopped abruptly in August 1970, just 1 month after the freight yard robbery. The investigation team requested access to Wong's property records and discovered that he had owned a warehouse facility on the outskirts of Vancouver's industrial district. The property had been purchased in cash in early 1969 and sold, also for cash, in September 1970. The timing aligned perfectly with the robbery timeline, suggesting that the warehouse had served a specific purpose during the planning and execution phases of the operation. Morrison obtained the address of Wong's former warehouse and conducted a site visit. The building had changed hands multiple times over the decades and was currently occupied by an automotive repair shop, but the structure itself remained largely unchanged from 1970. It was a simple concrete block building with loading docks and ample interior space for storing large items. Most significantly, it was located less than 2 miles from the freight yard where the robbery had occurred. The warehouse's proximity to the crime scene suggested it had served as a staging area or temporary storage facility for the stolen currency. The timing of Wang's property transactions indicated that the entire operation had been planned well in advance, with assets acquired and disposed of according to a predetermined schedule. This level of organization implied a conspiracy involving multiple individuals with specific roles and responsibilities. Morrison's team began mapping the connections between Chen, Wang, and other individuals who might have participated in the robbery. They examined employment records, property transactions, and financial activities for anyone associated with either man during the critical time period. The investigation revealed a network of relationships that extended far beyond what the original investigators had considered. One name that emerged from this analysis was David Liu, a truck driver who had worked for several transportation companies in the Vancouver area during 1970. Liu's employment records showed that he had been hired by different companies on short-term contracts, often for just a few weeks at a time. This pattern of temporary employment was unusual for truck drivers, who typically sought steady, long-term positions with reliable employers. More significantly, Liu had been employed by a freight forwarding company that held contracts for transporting goods to and from the Vancouver rail yard. His work records showed that he had made multiple deliveries to the facility during the months leading up to the robbery. Like Chen, Liu had terminated his employment abruptly in July 1970, just days before the crime occurred. The investigation team requested Liu's immigration records and discovered that he had arrived in Vancouver in 1966, sponsored by the same import company that had later sponsored Marcus Chen. The connection established a clear pattern of coordinated immigration and employment placement that suggested long-term planning for the robbery conspiracy. But Liu presented a more complex investigative challenge than Chen or Wang. While Chen had disappeared completely after the robbery, and Wang had dissolved his business and maintained a low profile, Liu had continued living in Vancouver under his legal name for several years after 1970. He had eventually started his own small trucking company, operated it successfully through the 1980s, and then retired to a modest home in Richmond. Morrison faced a delicate decision about how to approach Liu. At 78 years old, he represented the investigation's best hope for obtaining first-hand information about the robbery conspiracy. But he was also a potential suspect in a major federal crime, even though the statute of limitations had long since expired. Any interview would need to be carefully conducted to avoid compromising the investigation while encouraging cooperation. The team decided to begin with discreet surveillance and background research before making direct contact. They obtained Liu's current address and conducted physical observation of his daily routines. What they discovered was an elderly man living quietly in retirement, maintaining a small garden, and occasionally visiting a community center in Richmond's Chinese district. There were no obvious signs of wealth or extravagant lifestyle that might suggest access to stolen funds. Liu's financial records, obtained through legal channels, showed a modest but consistent income history. His trucking company had generated steady profits through the 1980s, and he had filed regular tax returns and maintained conventional bank accounts. If he had profited from the 1970 robbery, the money had been either well concealed or disposed of decades earlier. The investigation team prepared extensively before approaching Liu for an interview. They studied Chinese cultural protocols for respectful interaction with elderly individuals, consulted with community leaders about appropriate ways to request cooperation, and arranged for a Cantonese interpreter to ensure clear communication. The interview was scheduled as an informal conversation rather than an official interrogation, conducted at Liu's home with his consent. Liu's initial reaction to the investigators' visit was one of polite confusion. He acknowledged his employment history in the transportation industry and confirmed his connections to both Chen and Wang, whom he described as acquaintances from Vancouver's Chinese community. But he denied any knowledge of criminal activity and expressed surprise that his name had emerged in connection with an old robbery case. The interview revealed that Liu possessed detailed knowledge of freight yard operations and security procedures from his years as a truck driver. He was familiar with the layout of the Vancouver facility, the typical schedules for different types of cargo, and the protocols used for handling high-value shipments. This knowledge would have been valuable for planning the robbery, but it was also the natural result of his legitimate employment in the transportation industry. When shown photographs of the handwritten note discovered in the hidden locker, Liu examined the writing carefully, but claimed not to recognize the handwriting or the specific content. He acknowledged that he had attended meetings with other Chinese immigrants during the early 1970s, often to discuss employment opportunities or community issues. But he insisted that he had never participated in any discussions about criminal activities. Liu's responses were consistent and believable, but they left significant questions unanswered. His connections to both Chen and Wang, combined with his employment history and transportation expertise, made him a logical candidate for involvement in the robbery conspiracy. Yet there was no direct evidence linking him to the actual crime, and his long residence in Vancouver suggested someone who had nothing to hide from authorities. The investigation team decided to pursue additional lines of inquiry while maintaining periodic contact with Liu. They expanded their search to include other individuals who had been associated with Wang's import company or who had worked in the transportation industry during the relevant time period. They also requested assistance from international law enforcement agencies to trace the movements of Chen and other potential suspects who might have fled Canada after the robbery. One promising lead emerged from archived customs records at Vancouver International Airport. The records showed that Marcus Chen had departed Canada on July 20th, 1970, just 4 days after the robbery. His destination was Hong Kong, and his travel documents indicated that he was returning permanently to his country of origin. The timing of his departure confirmed that he had been in Vancouver during the robbery and had fled immediately afterward. More intriguingly, the customs records showed that Chen had not traveled alone. 3 other individuals with Chinese surnames had departed on the same flight, all claiming to be returning to Hong Kong for family reasons. The passenger manifest included Wang and 2 other names that had not previously appeared in the investigation. The coordinated departure suggested that the entire conspiracy had included predetermined escape plans for all participants. Morrison requested additional information about the other passengers who had departed with Chen and Wang. The investigation revealed that all 4 men had entered Canada during the same 2-year period and had obtained immigration sponsorship through businesses connected to Wang's import company. Their employment histories showed similar patterns of temporary work in transportation-related industries, followed by abrupt termination just before or immediately after the July 1970 robbery. The evidence pointed to a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving at least 4 individuals who had immigrated to Canada specifically for the purpose of committing the freight yard robbery. They had established legitimate business and employment relationships to provide cover for their activities, gathered intelligence about federal transportation security over a period of months, and executed their escape plan with the same precision they had applied to the crime itself. But significant questions remained about the ultimate fate of the stolen money and whether any members of the conspiracy had remained in Canada. David Liu's continued presence in Vancouver suggested that not all participants had fled the country. The investigation team prepared to expand their search for other potential accomplices who might still be living in the area under their original identities or carefully constructed aliases. The discovery of Marcus Chen's name had transformed a cold case into an active investigation with multiple leads and promising avenues for further inquiry. After 54 years, the Vancouver freight yard robbery was finally beginning to yield its secrets. The revelation that multiple conspirators had fled to Hong Kong immediately after the robbery forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable truth. The sophisticated planning, coordinated escape, and international scope of the operation suggested connections to organized criminal networks that extended far beyond a simple freight yard heist. Detective Morrison requested assistance from the Royal Hong Kong Police, hoping to trace the movements of Chen, Wang, and their associates after their departure from Vancouver. The response from Hong Kong authorities was both illuminating and frustrating. Records showed that all four men had indeed arrived in Hong Kong on July 20, 1970, but their subsequent activities were poorly documented. Hong Kong in the early 1970s was a chaotic mix of legitimate business and underground commerce, where individuals with sufficient resources could easily disappear into the crowded urban landscape. The police had no record of criminal activity involving any of the four names, but they also had no evidence of their continued residence in the territory. More troubling was the discovery that Thomas Wang had departed Hong Kong just 6 months after his arrival, traveling to Taiwan with documentation that suggested permanent relocation. From there, his trail went completely cold. Immigration records showed no further movement, and Taiwanese authorities had no current information about his whereabouts or activities. It appeared that Wang had used Hong Kong as a temporary staging area before vanishing into a region where Western law enforcement had limited reach. The investigation team faced a stark reality. After 54 years, the physical evidence was fragmentary. The witnesses were elderly or deceased, and the primary suspects had likely spent decades beyond the reach of Canadian justice. Even if Chen, Wang, or their associates were located and arrested, the statute of limitations had long since expired for most charges related to the original robbery. But Morrison refused to let the case end in frustration. The discovery of Marcus Chen's name had already rewritten the history of one of Canada's most notorious unsolved crimes. Even if criminal prosecution was impossible, the investigation had value for understanding how sophisticated criminal organizations operated during the early 1970s and what vulnerabilities they had exploited in federal transportation security. The team prepared a comprehensive final report documenting their findings and the connections they had uncovered. The report confirmed that the Vancouver freight yard robbery had been carried out by an organized conspiracy involving at least 4 individuals who had entered Canada with criminal intent. The operation had required months of planning, insider knowledge of federal transportation procedures, and carefully coordinated escape plans that had allowed the perpetrators to flee the country with their stolen proceeds. The $2.5 million in federal currency had likely been transported out of Canada within days of the robbery, either through smuggling networks or legitimate business channels controlled by the conspirators. The money had probably been converted to other forms of wealth or deposited in offshore accounts where it could be accessed without detection by Canadian authorities. For Detective Morrison and her team, the investigation represented both success and limitation. They had solved the mystery of how the robbery was executed and identified the individuals responsible. But they had also demonstrated the challenges faced by law enforcement when pursuing international criminals with sophisticated planning capabilities and access to global financial networks. The case file was officially closed in late 2024, marked as solved but not prosecuted due to the passage of time and the unavailability of suspects. The handwritten note discovered in the hidden locker was preserved as evidence, along with all the documentation that had led to the identification of the conspiracy members. David Liu, the one potential suspect who had remained in Vancouver, was never charged with any crime. The evidence linking him to the robbery remained circumstantial, and his cooperation with the investigation suggested someone who had either played a minor role in the conspiracy or had successfully distanced himself from criminal activity decades earlier. The Vancouver freight yard robbery of 1970 had finally been solved, not through traditional detective work, but through the patient accumulation of evidence over more than half a century. A single hidden note bearing a forgotten name had unlocked secrets that had remained buried for 54 years, proving that even the most carefully planned crimes could eventually be exposed by the relentless march of time and the persistence of investigators who refused to give up. The stolen millions were never recovered, and justice in the traditional sense was never served. But the truth had finally emerged from the shadows, transforming one of Canada's greatest criminal mysteries into a solved case that would be studied and remembered for generations to come.